Okay, well, welcome everybody to Solar Noon Tuesday, and I apologize for the fact that my graphics have decided not to work. They're beautiful. Let me just point it out. Beautiful, beautiful graphics. Sound like a certain politician. Okay, so in the news this week, the New Mexico Public Regulatory Commission has adopted what a lot of states are hoping are going to be a model template for statewide interconnection rules for hooking up large solar arrays to the grid. What they did is they adopted essentially the plan that was put together by IREC, and IREC is the Interstate Renewable Energy Council. And they have been on this multi-year project with one of those torturous acronyms called batteries. Don't even remember what batteries stands for, but it meant something. But anyway, they're saying one of the issues with solar at the moment is that the interconnection process is broken. It really is, and there are oftentimes 2-3 year waits for these large systems to connect in. So they're trying to push through industry best practices. And many of these old interconnection rules are based on old technology. And the newer technologies, when you have a distributed energy system, it has the ability to regulate how much energy is dumped onto the grid. So if the grids can't handle it, these systems can accommodate some of that. But the rules are not based on that. There's also an inherent issue, conflict of interest issue that goes on with these interconnection agreements, because it's the utility that is the primary competitor with the company that's trying to connect to the grid. But it is the utility that controls access to the grid. So it's basically like, Target having to go to Walmart to ask them if they can open up a shop, so there's a lot of this inherent conflict there. There's also changes in the way that when there are upgrades to the grid required, then what's happened in the past is the company that's asking to be connected has to pay for all of those upgrades. The analogy there is to basically say, okay, let's say if you've got a highway that can handle 1,000 cars and you happen to be the guy driving the 1,001 car, then you've got to pay all the costs for adding another lane to the highway system. So what they're saying is, listen, why don't we put a small portion of everybody's fees into this to handle the ongoing upgrades that are required? So that's part of this template that's being put into place. They're hoping that this will all trickle down throughout the various other state requirements or state legislatures or regulatory bodies. The Wisconsin Habitat for Humanity has announced that they're doing a test with 49 different sites that are installing solar as part of this. They're working with the Midwest Renewable Energy Association, Maria, and that's a group that's been quite active up in there in the Wisconsin area. They've begun this process November. They're hoping that it'll be completed the middle of next year. But it is one of those things I've actually been personally approached by Habitat to say, how can we integrate solar into the build? So I think we're going to see a lot more of that. There's a bill in California that has been introduced recently by a fella, Senator John Becker. And what this is doing is incentivizing solar canopies or solar carports within that state. Similarly, there was another bill in Washington state in March that does the same kind of thing. And the philosophy here, and I think it's a good one, is that if they're going to meet these goals, these long-term goals for solar, then you're going to use up a lot of land. So we should incentivize dual purposing, where there's a lot of land that's being used as parking spaces. In fact, there's a study by, I think it was the Lawrence Berkeley Labs, that said that in most large urban environments, between 35% and 50% of all of the surface area within that city is hard surface, buildings, parking lots, roads, sidewalks, things like that. And 40% of that is parking lots. So if you can dual purpose this land and say, all right, now we're going to use it not only for parking, but we're going to use it for energy generation, it can only be a good thing. We've discussed about how we're taking good farmland, good virgin land out of production for solar. Let's try and steer the development of solar into rooftops, parking areas, brownfields, as we mentioned last week. All of those will help us get to those goals, but do it in a more environmentally friendly manner. France, notably, just recently passed a law in France that any parking lot with more than 80 spaces has to have solar on it. So yeah, somebody was saying that brownfields, can I reference that study? I'll give it a shot. I'll try and put that out later as to which study about the 35 to 50%. Okay, let's see. The ABF, the American Battery Factory, has announced they're putting a big lithium-ion battery facility near Tucson, Arizona. This thing is pretty large. This is part of the fallout of the Inflation Reduction Act. And so it's anticipated it's going to create about 1,000 jobs in that region. It's going to be about 2 million square feet, 267 acres for that one facility, and they'll invest about $1.2 billion. So that's an example of how we're really seeing this Inflation Reduction Act bringing a lot of domestic production here to the U.S. And I did have one item here about the consumer complaints against Pink Energy. That was reported as news, and the more I investigated it, the more I found it was kind of old news, where it had all kind of happened back in October. And what it was is there were about 9 different states attorneys general who filed a letter asking lenders not to work with Pink Energy anymore in providing them financing for solar. And it was largely because there were just massive numbers of complaints within these state attorneys general's facilities, offices against this company. Well, of course, like these guys do, they then filed bankruptcy and ran away. And now they've left everybody with about $140 million in debt, fired all the staff. And actually, the fella who was in charge of this, I'll talk a little bit more because this sort of inspired my topic for this week, which was to do a little bit of update about scams. And excuse me. Anyway, he's a typical one of these scammer guys. He's all over social media talking about how it's all fake news and how he was abused as a child and everybody's out to get him. So yeah, there's almost a template for these guys. Okay, so that's the news from this week. Does anybody else have anything they want to add to that, or anything to bring up for the good of the cause? Give everybody a second.
Hey Jay, I was online looking at a YouTuber, an electrician doing some upgrade, and he was talking about the entrances where the meter connects. And he was saying that a lot of those connections are not suitable for upgrades up to like what we're talking about if we're gonna like put some electrical vehicle or some sort of thing and connect to our array. He basically said that they're a fire hazard, and I'm pretty sure he said that they were rated for 60. Is it, what am I trying to say here? 600 watts or
60 amps, you mean?
60 amp, yes, that's what I'm trying to say. 60.
Yeah.
And if you try to upgrade those to 100, you're going to have some problems.
Yeah.
So, and he was, he was basically going in and looking at the meter sockets. Something just, I'm kind of be aware of when I'm doing some work. So,
Yeah, I think what you're referencing there, if we look back historically, back in the 1950s or so, the standard residential home had 60 amp service. It was low levels of electricity. Then as it evolved by the 1970s or so, we were seeing standardization at around 100 amp service. So the service panels, the circuit breakers were being installed with, they were at least obviously 100 amp boxes with a 100 amp breaker. And then the wire coming from the transformer through the meter from the utility was at least capable of handling 100 amp. Well, in the intervening years from the 70s to today, it's kind of evolved to 200 amp service being the norm for new installations. So now you've got at least a 200 amp box, 200 amp service, 200 amp breaker. And what we talked about before with the advent of electric vehicles and some of the other battery backup issues and things like that, do we have to begin to think of the idea that we're going to 400 amp service? That is going to require a number of things. And just like you're saying, these 60 amps. So if you've got something legacy all the way back to the 50s and the electric hasn't been upgraded since then, yeah, you're basically going to have to do a bunch of rewiring, at least up to and including replacing the service panel in order to, before you ever consider solar. That just seems kind of, at least in my mind, without seeing a specific example, a no-brainer. But another thing, another wrench to throw in there is the new National Electrical Code does require that you have a utility disconnect switch, a utility disconnect at the meter, essentially. So what we're talking about there is, you've got the meter itself, and then oftentimes you'll see a box connected to the meter where there's like a main breaker and then a couple of double pole breakers underneath of it. And then that feeds in to your main service panel. Well, those are going to be required. It's in the 2023 code. So it's going to be a number of years before these codes are adopted in different locations. But the question is, will a inspector say you're putting in a solar array? Now you're significantly changing the configuration of your electrical system. So you need to upgrade with this switch, with this utility disconnect switch. So that's going to require that you put in, a couple $1,000 unit there. I'm just throwing out a couple thousand. I don't know what an electrician would charge to put that in. But if it costs that much for a new service panel, it probably costs that much for that main disconnect. But may not be a bad idea to start thinking about putting those in just as a matter of course, especially if you're in a situation where you're going to have to turn off the power from the grid anyway. So the reason I say that is because I'm thinking that if you've got what is essentially a service panel outside next to your meter, now you've got access to come in with batteries, with EV chargers, with making a connection without having to drill through the wall to get to the service panel. So I think we just have to sort of plug in those disconnect units into our thinking as we're doing residential systems. Anybody have any comment on that or think I'm full of it? So. All right. Okay. Well, let me get into the scammer thing, the scammer update. And again, I apologize. I have all sorts of pretty graphics, but every time I tried to bring that up, it just froze the screen. So I didn't want to battle with all of that. Rather just get kind of into the meat and potatoes of it. But the specific allegations there are the latest bad player in the game that on a big scale is a company called Pink Solar. And many of you guys may be familiar with them. It seemed like for a long time there, every time I looked at a YouTube video, I would get, wait, don't pay too much for solar until you watch this kind of thing, or the government is giving away huge amounts of money. You can get solar for free, all of those kind of things. And it's, it really is the aluminum siding salesman guys. So what happened was there's a company called Power Home Solar, is a North Carolina based company, started in around 2014 or so, just a small installation company. But then they decided to get big into the online advertising, and then hiring a bunch of people to go out, commission only salespeople to go knocking door to door, selling solar, telling people it's going to do amazing stuff. It's not going to cost you anything, that kind of stuff. So they grew very quickly. That they were in the Inc. 5,000 fastest growing companies for 5 years in a row. In fact, they were ranked as high as like 20th in fastest growing companies one of those years. By the time we get to 2020, I think it is, they were bringing in about $365 million a year in revenue, and had 2,000 employees in about 15 states. And then it sort of started unraveling a little bit. I think a lot of the unraveling came about by a local reporter for a television news station up in Detroit. And it's interesting, you can see some of these profiles online, but oh my gosh, he just devastated the company. He essentially went out and interviewed a lot of the customers, and they were telling horror stories. And then he got the CEO, who is a fellow who's just full of himself. His name's Jason Weller, and he's one of these, had his podcasts. You know how podcast people can be, they're annoying. And then you had he best-selling book about own your own power and how don't let the bastards get you down kind of thing. It was, very much a one of those, I'm an uneducated poor guy from wherever, and look at me now, I'm a billionaire, and you should all think I'm wonderful and everything I say is wonderful. So anyway, this reporter just took him to the woodshed and smacked him down big and hard, and really made him look the fool. So immediately what they did is decided to change the name of the company. So they ran, and instead of Power Home Solar, it suddenly became Pink Energy, and they continued to do the same grift. And basically what the grift is you send out a commission-only salesperson knocking on doors. Don't give them any training. Don't give them any understanding about what solar is, what solar does. And then they just lie to people. They tell them it's going to produce all sorts of stuff that it doesn't produce. They're going to tell them they're selling them leasing for these systems, but then telling them they'll also be getting the federal tax credits, which is not true. Because part of the advantage of the leasing agent is they get all of those tax credits. So they're telling people who don't understand what they're hearing a bunch of lies. Then they subcontracted out the installation. They used inferior products. They had no skill, no training, and the systems didn't perform. So everybody was upset. Everybody was mad. And oftentimes they were charging $6, $7, $8 a watt for these systems when the average was $3. So they're overcharging for the systems. Then some of their salespeople started doing things like falsifying credit applications, getting loans in people's names that nobody knew who they were. So it was just an out of control grifter kind of scheme. So then they were confronted with it once again, and then they just declared bankruptcy and ran away, closed their doors. So we're seeing this thing over and over. So I thought, well, there's a number of things online that talk about what you should look for, because if you guys go out and sell these systems, one of the issues that I get excited about is that these systems are pretty miraculous, and they do some amazing things when they're installed properly and when they work properly. And the financing of them, the incentive programs right now are too good to believe, they're too good to be true. So many of the things where it says, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Well, that's true, but it is kind of miraculous. It is kind of too good to be true. So how do you get beyond that? People simply will not believe you. Well, and then of course you get the people who are going to mislead regardless. So the first rule of thumb, I think, is that solar should be bought and not sold. This is something my dad always used to tell me about insurance. Insurance should be bought and not sold. If somebody comes to you trying to sell you insurance, don't buy it. But if you decide you need insurance, go buy it. It's like same thing with solar. If you think you want solar, go buy it. Seek people out. But if somebody comes to you out of the blue, probably something to be wary of. Certainly wary when they're commission-only sales guys. There's usually no local knowledge, so oftentimes these salespeople will simply tell you anything, even if it's not true in that location. Another rule of thumb I would say, as far as avoiding getting caught in these schemes, is with any major purchase. One rule that my wife Annie and I have always done is, if we're going to make a major purchase, from the moment we decide we're going to do it, we will wait at least 24 hours before signing anything. So it doesn't matter what it is. I think we said at one point, if it's more than $100. So, and it's funny, I remember one time when we were in our early 20s, a water softener sales guy was trying to convince us to buy a water softening system for the house. And they made a good pitch, about all the soap we would save and everything, and finally we decided, okay, yeah, I think we're going to go ahead. This sounds like a good idea, but we're going to wait 24 hours before we decide. And this guy got so angry. He's like, if you don't sign right now, our studies show that you likely will not sign tomorrow. And we're like, well, okay, if I decide I'm not going to do it, that's good as far as I'm concerned. That's not an argument in my case. Which brings you to the next thing to be cautious about, is the high pressure sales. If somebody's really pushing, then usually it's time to back off. It's like, again, one of the truisms my father always used to say is, the deal of a lifetime comes along every single day. So, if it's a good deal today, it'll be a good deal tomorrow. If it's not, well, there will be a good deal tomorrow. So don't fall for that. You got to do it today. There's limited time offer. Yeah, that is never true. Really never true. And always get competitive bids. So, if you just follow some of those things, three bids. Yeah. See Chris raising 3. So those are some of the issues. Let me see. Oh, make sure that there's a technical, if the person can't explain it to you in simple terms, what's happening, then, don't do it. If you don't understand how the thing's going to work, then don't buy it. This stuff is not rocket science. So if they're trying to make it too complicated, or it's clear that they don't understand it themselves, then don't buy it from them. If they're going to be working with subcontractors, that's a big red flag to worry about there. And then, of course, once you've made the decision, then you start digging down into what products are going to be used, what's the market reputation of those products, what kind of warranties are involved, what kind of insurances are involved, who is going to provide those kind of warranties. So those are the issues there to bring up. And in addition to pink energy, which is the latest, we've been through this, at least to my knowledge, at least 3 times, where large national companies come up. Vivint Solar was perhaps the first one. Solar City, which is Tesla, basically, that was another one of those that collapsed under its own weight. And now we've gone through the Power Home Solar and pink energy thing. I think what it demonstrates, at least for this industry in its iteration at the moment, that the local is always something to focus on. Pretty much every time we've seen the emergence of a large national brand in the solar industry, it's one of these scammer types. They grow very quickly and then they collapse under their own weight because they're overpriced, their people are undertrained, their installations are shoddy, and they don't deliver what they promise. And eventually that's going to catch up with you. So when you're buying a system, those of you who provide the service, that's good that, the marketplace is really rewarding local people who are invested in the community, who are willing to do long-term, sustainable business development within a limited geographic range. So, I see a note here. Jennifer Grantham was set to announce a major scientific. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. The hard fusion. Okay. That's a whole nother thing. Cold fusion, whatever. Yeah. Okay. Before we get into fusion, because that's a fun topic we can touch on for a second. Anybody have any comment or any horror stories you've run into in that world of grifters? You're all being way too passive here for me. So, okay, let's jump in then to cold fusion. Many of you guys are around long enough to have remembered, what was it, Pons and Fleischmann, the whole cold fusion in a bottle kind of thing, and that blew up for a while and faded. Y'all, first off, has everybody heard the announcement about fusion and more energy coming out than going in kind of thing? Anybody? Bill, you got a comment there?
No, it seems to be something that's been going around for the last 30 years.
Mm-hmm. It's one of those that it's almost like a perpetual motion machine or whatever. You think it sounds good. I mean, we know fusion works. We have fusion. Fusion is the sun, solar. So it works on that scale. Question is, does it work on a smaller scale? And I guess the thing that occurred to me is, if it does work, is it something that we need, given that renewables are getting so inexpensive, that energy is in such abundance? It always strikes me when I hear these big announcements, I think somebody's getting some pretty hefty grants, somewhere. And a lot of this hype is all about how to find government money. So I don't know. Am I being too skeptical?
No, I don't think so. And I think that apparently the fluxes produced by fusion can produce as much radioactivity as fission. So you still end up with radioactive waste. So I'm going to have to be proven, shown that this works before I'll buy it.
Yeah. I guess maybe it burned us several times. We'll see. Speaking of radioactive waste, I guess in another vein, where we just here in Ohio dodged a bullet for the moment. The legislature was looking at passing a bill to create what was essentially a nuclear commission at the state level that had no oversight from anybody. in order to regulate the nuclear industry within the state. And that did not get a hearing, and the state legislature is now going to be shutting down for a bit. But it was a real thing that raised a lot of issues, specifically around the Piketon plant. We had a nuclear power plant that was operating in Southern Ohio for a number of years, for a number of decades, back in, I guess, the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, up until the 80s. They had a few minor problems, things like the fact that they released radioactivity into the environment on a relatively frequent basis. They used radioactive materials to spray the roads for de-icing and things. They plowed it into the fields, they dumped it into the river, and then kind of said, oops. And so a number of these companies that I know, Lockheed Martin is one of them. I guess one of the things that gets me is these companies like that, General Electric, Lockheed Martin, operate these big systems, create what amounts to billions of dollars in cleanup, but seem to then be allowed to just walk away and go, yeah, my bad. All right, let's go. I'm out of here. And nobody, no consequences there. So that's very frustrating. So because there was no oversight and all these things happened, they've had to shut it down. They just found now that there's like triple or quadruple the level of radioactivity in nearby middle school. Still, because when they demolished it, they didn't contain the dust and allowed that to filter out throughout the area. It's a nightmare. So then our state legislature has decided the best way to deal with this is to get a group of industry people with no oversight from the outside to manage the system once again. So,
Jay, that sounds like a tag-along bill to HB 6. Sounds like a great complementary bill.
Yeah. Well, our Ohio is not really showing itself to be an enlightened community when it comes to energy policy.
I think, Tony, there's probably a lot of the same players involved.
Yeah,
Certainly. Yeah, the FBI didn't get them all. There's certainly hanging around.
Oh, there's still indictments coming. The other possibility that we're being pushed at this point, at the Kansas Energy Conference, they were talking about. In fact, they devoted a session on NuScale nuclear. These are the small reactors, and if security is becoming an issue around any of the big infrastructure, I know that last week and the week before there were some people firing into substations, shooting holes in transformers and things like that. And if we're having that problem with large reactors, and I know that that's one of the big issues is security around the big reactors, how are they going to secure a lot of small reactors? I mean, it introduces a whole nother scale of security, and I don't know what it would take in terms of, these are not really small. They're not like the backyard reactors, but I've wondered how much C4 it would take to turn one into a dirty bomb. Anyway, that's just my take on it.
right.
Yeah, Bill, you raised so many great points there, right? The first is the material is still the material, whether it's large scale or small scale. So part of the reason, and this is one of the reasons why nuclear is so expensive, but at the very least, it's consolidated in like a military installation like security in one spot, as opposed to like, let's make this 1/4 of the size and then have to do the same levels of security at 12 different places. That makes a ton of sense. But whether we're talking about fusion or fission, I think how I view this is also from a energy security / resiliency perspective. It doesn't solve what I think is one of the most fundamental issues, which is the issues with the distribution of electrons, right? Getting them from point A to point B. And so whether you can click your heels together 3 times and create magic energy, we still have a really spooky issue in this country with deferred maintenance and lack of reliability an increased number of power outages and blackouts and brownouts. And I think this problem will be made worse with electrification, as long as it's continued to be tied to this kind of fossil of a centrally managed grid system. So maybe we can, solve the magic generation of clean energy, but you still need to get it from wherever that central location is to everyone's homes, right? And here increasingly to support their transportation as well, not just their lives. So I think like for all of those reasons, it just makes more and more sense to generate your own energy on site, store it on site, and then electrify your vehicle, and then you're set.
Yeah, I think it reiterates what you were talking about before, Tony, about where when we talk about fueling of vehicles, we have to get outside of that post-World War II model of pulling up to a gas station and spending 5 minutes filling up the tank and going to the bathroom. We have to get beyond that concept of the spoken wheel kind of distribution and large centralized. We've got to reimagine the system. And that means actually not how do we rebuild the system, it's how do we reimagine the system. It's huge. It's a huge project.
This is something that we've had and I know in Chicago, ComEd had a problem. They were having people complaining about the fact that they were gold plating the distribution system as a way to compensate their investors for not having the opportunities in buying big generation plants. Same thing with Duke Energy. I know that Evergy, our big utility, is having the same problems. They just announced that they would have a $1.2 billion cost increase on their new, what they call the Sustainability Transformation Plan. And the Sustainability Transformation Plan is simply a grid reliance thing. And they're just bulking up on their investments in the distribution systems so that they have some investment opportunities for their stockholders. Yeah, the distribution system is a huge problem with the central utilities. I think traditionally it's been 60% of a utility's infrastructure is in distribution transmission. And at least in residential feeders, they are used up to half capacity only 15% of the time. So there's a whole lot of infrastructure that's just sitting there unused 85% of the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you point out, Bill, that the incentive process within our current system, our regulatory system, is that the companies make their money when they invest in infrastructure, when they throw, and there's no incentive to keep it cheaper. There's a lot of incentive to keep having cost overruns because that's where they make their profit. It's like if I make 10% return on $1 million, well, I make a lot more when I get 10% return on $1 billion. So, the regulatory people are going to give me that money regardless, because there's no competition. So the incentive is let's invest in things that may or may not be needed and not worry about the cost overruns. So projects like nuclear, that's perfect, right? You can dump lots and lots of money into that with no hope of it ever producing anything. It's like the old line in Ghostbusters, I worked in the private sector. They expect results, it's like, well, they don't expect results. They don't necessarily even want results. They want money spent, money spent means profit. And
it wasn't that long ago, Jay, was it, where the utility around here in Ohio, they begged for money and they got billions of dollars and said they needed infrastructure, and then they didn't do it. They gave it to the shareholders.
yeah, that sounds like a First Energy thing.
Yeah, but nobody did anything about it. I mean, they came back next year and said, well, we need that money again for the same thing. And then the guy said, well, why? And he said, well, we've decided to pay the shareholders instead of doing this. And the government gave him more money.
Sure. Well, the guy who said why probably got fired. So that's the way it goes. It really is. I'm in one of my cynical moods at the moment. I was listening to, gosh, what was it anyway? There's these things that were just horrific from a moral standpoint. All of these reports about, various contractors and processes and utilities and all of this stuff. And I just think this is morally repugnant. And they keep coming back to, yeah, but it's not illegal. You know, I just want to throw up my hands and say, when did that become the test? You know, shouldn't people just say it's wrong? And that's good enough. It's just wrong. It's wrong. You know, I don't care if it's illegal. You know, and that's why you got lawyers. I remember a guy I used to work with who worked at the very high levels of AT&T, and he said he was in a meeting, and he actually claims he heard this specifically, where the CEO of AT&T was saying, we're going to do this, and the lawyer in the room said, but that is illegal. And the CEO got so mad and pointed at the lawyer and said, your job is not to tell me what's legal and illegal. Your job is to make what I do legal. And you go, okay, that's the world we live in, you know? So sad. That's why I'm going to be poor my whole life. So anybody else? Anybody have any other comments about the moral morass that we live in? So,
Jay, one of the things I would, it's on the topic that we had earlier about the 60 amp panels instead of the 400 amp panels and so on. I would really like to hear, I understand that there are some problems with the line side taps that are the piercing variety of line side taps. I would like to know what the recommended, if there's hardware that is much better than others at some point. You know, we don't have to launch into it today, but I think that would be a topic that would be a help to a lot of people. I'm facing a panel right now that is chock full. It's probably a 40-year-old squared EQO panel that just won't take anymore, and it certainly won't pass the 120% test.
yeah.
So we're probably going to have to look at some kind of line side tap on this one. And I would like to understand what other people are using for line side taps,
And
because that's probably
by line side taps, you're talking about not necessarily just the ones that pierce through the insulation and make the connection.
Yes.
That's what you're talking about?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because for those who may not be understanding what Bill's saying, essentially when we do a load side connection, you're coming in somewhere on the circuit breaker, but you're saying, no, I need to now connect somewhere between the main disconnect and the meter. And to do that, oftentimes they'll come in and just simply pierce in using something that goes into the conductor to make a connection. But that way you can do it without having to disconnect service, in theory. I wouldn't want to, but in theory, you could. Is that something you've done, Bill, where you've had, or do you typically on a line side connection? I don't know if you're an electrician or not, but in my world, I would call an electrician to.
Oh yes, definitely. Yeah, definitely. And sometimes it means having to pull the meter, and sometimes the utility is not really happy about pulling the meter for you to connect a small PV system. So,
Yeah.
Usually it's between the external disconnect and the breaker panel. So at least you can disconnect it's not a hot service entry when you're doing the work. But I would certainly like to hear what other people are using for that type of connection, because we are running into, I think there was a survey that DOE did, and they said that like 80% of our housing is pre-1950. A lot of these houses have very small panels.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you say panels, you mean the circuit breaker box,
the breaker
service panel. Yeah. That's one of those confusing things, because solar panels and service panels often get people confused there. But this is one of those advantages, as I mentioned earlier, about having that utility disconnect. What you're doing there is essentially installing a pre-configured line side tap connection point somewhere, right there at your meter. That's an option, and it may become the go-to option, where no longer are we even talking about load side connections as the norm for small solar. We may be talking about everybody coming into what is essentially a supply side connection or a line side connection at one of those disconnect boxes that's attached to the meter itself.
Now, one of the things that they have that our utility is requiring is that they want a disconnect that has an air brake, a visible air brake. So it's got to be a solid bar disconnect instead of a breaker panel. So a breaker, you can't see that there's an air gap in the breakers, so they don't allow that. It's probably an administrative problem with this utility, but I suspect that a lot of you also have that problem with your utilities, where it has to be not a breaker, but I call them one-arm bandit disconnects. It's a solid bar disconnect that you pull down the handle and that's your disconnect.
Yeah, one of those blade kind of things that
Exactly.
they can be fused or unfused depending. Yeah. Well, that's I don't know. I've not run into that. I think we're going to run into more of it with when we start talking about software solutions on load management and things like that, where people are not necessarily willing to trust the technology. You know, they might want more old school solutions.
Well, I think that's where our utility is coming from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, you get a bunch of guys who goes, if I can stick a credit card in between it, I know that there's no electricity going there. So that's well, those days are probably gone. Those we're gonna. It reminds me when we were talking. I was on another discussion forum where we talked about what does it mean to have a facility battery ready. And California, of course, has a lot of rules going in place in about buildings when they're made must be battery ready. And what they've done is essentially said, you need to have a minimum 225 amp service panel. That's one thing. And secondly, have essentially a sub panel for critical loads. And then they specifically outlined what some of those critical loads would be. Well, that all sounds good, except now we're getting more into the world of software controlled load management. And do you really need a sub panel if you can handle specific circuits or specific loads and turn those off, using software? And it just reminded me a little bit years ago when we built our Earthship and we built the house, and I was big into telecommunications at the time. So I decided this thing's going to be state of the art, man. We're going to put in fiber to every room. We're putting in coax. We're putting in category 5 twisted pair, everything, a big patch panel. And everything's wireless. We don't use any of it. I mean, I've invested thousands into this. And it was useless. It was useless almost from day one. So, are we doing the same thing? We're going to put in a lot of infrastructure to make everything battery ready, EV charging station ready, whatever it is ready. And then it turns out technology just shoots right past us and we end up, who knows, wireless or using cold fusion in our vehicle with Marty McFly and, putting broccoli in the engine. So
Rooftop.
what I'm learning more than and you guys probably already know this, but I got a new heat pump, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago. And it's a Lennox kind of thing, and they said it was solar ready, and I was like, well, whatever, okay, that sounds good. But it turns out that I'm now looking at a solar, PV array for the house, and they were like, and I would like to be able to run my heat pump. And they said, well, if your heat pump surges when it turns on, then, it's the batteries, it's just going to kill it. It's not going to be able to be served by solar. But my solar ready heat pump actually comes on very gradually and doesn't surge at the beginning. And I'm wondering if, these legislative folks that are requiring things, for instance, in California, are thinking about stuff like that, like appliances and, services within the home that might create a surge that, just can't be handled by a battery, rather than the silly load center stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think that brings up a lot of different points, as far as those surge capacities, especially when we deal with standalone systems and batteries, you've got to build that into your infrastructure. But I was thinking more in terms of some of the things we've talked about, like Tony, and about charging stations and the like, and how it has such a tremendous draw on the grid, even grid tied. And I wonder what the cumulative impact of reducing surges for startup of motors. And you can do that with equipment, with capacitors and whatever else it is. I know they sell them, but I think it's mostly just a capacitor, isn't it, of some sort? And it they call it a dampening unit or something. Anyway, you're again dealing with load management. How, when, power is drawn, and how and when power is put back onto the grid. This is going to become more and more of an issue for all of us at the individual level and at the grid level. So not sure. I see Tony's shaking his head, but surge things, I would imagine. Well, with the charging stations, I don't think you're dealing with huge startup surges, but you're dealing with huge loads when they're being used, and not so huge, when they're not. It's like I don't know, drinking from a fire hose. You've got to have the infrastructure to handle that maximum number, whatever that is, whether it's being from a charging station or whether it's from a surge of a big motor.
Meg, we've always had problems with that with water pumps, because water is really heavy and you have a high column of water that's sitting on the pump, and so it's always been a problem with high surges to get water. And also, I mean, as your point with the heat pumps, starting a compressor takes a fairly big surge. I know that there was a report about a ultra capacitor company in Estonia that was producing ultra capacitors that were being used for buses, electric buses. And of course, you've got a huge starting surge with an electric bus. So, they had these capacitors that were taking massive amounts of power and delivering it to where the cable would just wriggle when the capacitor was shorted. I mean, it would just run, the cable would just wriggle on the floor because of the power that this capacitor was able to handle. So that's going to be a real, I mean, that's a possibility for a lot of these things that's going to become available, probably at the residential scale, and probably in combination with batteries, because you can combine the capacitor in series with the battery and come up with one that has a huge capacity.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I think we've sort of rambled about on this discussion, which is great. We're dealing with a lot of the issues that are popping into people's minds, but I appreciate the feedback. I think we're at the end here. I was going to mention that I'm going to take the next 2 weeks off from these meetings since we're heading into the holiday season. So I'll send out a notice letting you guys know who typically join that we're not going to have it. But we'll start back up in about 2 weeks. So for those of you out there, have a happy holiday, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. All right.
Jay, thanks for keeping this going. And thank you, Jay, for keeping this going, and happy holiday too.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jay.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Jay.